This playlist will collect together and organize the individual component modules that will take us from the ending of the Roman Empire up through the Renaissance and Scientific Revolution so that we can talk about Descartes and the British empiricists. We'll begin by giving just a little bit of background information about scholasticism in the Middle Ages, the European Renaissance, and the Scientific Revolution. Then we'll turn our attention to Descartes himself. We'll discuss his dualistic oppositional ontological framework, his mechanistic physiological explanation of bodily motion and sensation, the difficulties that he encounters nevertheless in explaining the interaction of mind and body, and we'll end the lecture by turning our attention towards the British empiricists and their mental chemistry framework for understanding and explaining the mind. So while it's true that Descartes' project in the Meditations is a project in epistemology, it also has the purpose of attempting to clear away the barriers to the scientific revolution, since this may be the first time students have discussed scholasticism or the medieval period in philosophy. I'm going to go ahead and review the rather superficial discussion that's given to you in your chapter. I think that Descartes' life and his work provide a microcosm of the changes and challenges that are wrought by the important intellectual, social, and economic developments that characterize the transition between the Middle Ages and the European Renaissance, especially as it manifests in the scientific revolution. Thus, it's important to understand these periods. The medieval period, also often called the Middle Ages, was a European historical period that began roughly around 500 CE and ended roughly around 1500 to 1600 CE. Scholasticism is a movement spanning approximately from 1100 CE to around 1500 CE, so about 400 years. Researchers tend to divide the scholastic period and the philosophy therein into three important periods. Researchers tend to divide scholastic philosophy into three important periods, usually known as the pre-scholastic or early scholastic, the scholastic or high scholastic, and the late scholastic periods. The late scholastic period commonly refers to the time period from approximately 1350 to 1650 CE. The late scholastic period includes figures like William of Ockham and Duns Scotus. The earlier pre-scholastic period includes most notably St. Anselm and runs from approximately Anselm's date of birth around 1033 to about 1250 CE. Classic high scholasticism runs from 1250 to 1350 CE and includes such figures as St. Thomas Aquinas. As a movement, scholasticism designates the interests, influences, and methodologies, primarily of educated religious figures. Universities began to be founded in the 1200s throughout Europe, but were staffed and attended primarily by clergy for much of that period. The subject matter of the schools consisted of Latin translations, either from Greek or Arabic into Latin, of Aristotle's writings, commentaries thereon, and other miscellaneous but closely related texts. One of scholasticism's main methodologies involved the analysis of existent scholarly opinions on a question or on a set of questions. The goal was to create a clear line of argumentation representing different opinions and exploring their contradictions and potential for reconciliation. As a result, if I had to characterize scholasticism as an intellectual movement and the scholars participating in it as individuals, I would have to characterize them as a relatively small and isolated group of individuals. Isolated really in two senses. On the one hand, they represent a very small proportion of their country's population, and they live a life that's relatively removed from the lives of everyday citizens. On the other hand, they're even more dramatically removed from the thriving cultural and scientific traditions developing in the Muslim caliphates and in China during this very same historical period. Looking at scholasticism itself, we would have to characterize it as a conservative conservative intellectual movement. It's focused primarily on understanding and clarifying a very small body of writings that it inherits from the Romans and the Greeks. It's not particularly focused on new knowledge generation, on observation or experimentation. It's primarily focused on textual exegesis through dialectical disputation.